Hello and welcome to another dose of medieval history with our resident historian, Aidan Mattis from the fantastic Law Lodge podcast. How's it going today, Aidan?
Good, good.
Very good. So last time we
Yeah.
spoke about diseases of the Middle Ages, didn't we? And the general way of life that contributed to the development and spreading of diseases. And that I found it fascinating, and it's hopefully you've out there enjoyed it for the sort of world building inspiration and ideas. And we're going to carry on that train today. And I wanted to ask you about archery in the medieval era because I think it is often misportrayed as
A little bit,
just a little bit.
a little bit.
So why don't you take it away, Aidan?
Yeah, sure. So, archery obviously, as a method of warfare, dates back, a couple thousand years. You get biblical accounts of archery. You get Mycenaean, Greek, and Egyptian accounts of archers being involved in battles. But the Middle Ages is, I'd say, the period that is most commonly associated with archery, and it's simply because I think it is this period during which archers are most portrayed in actual art and in literature. And you get obviously the tale of Robin Hood from around 15th century England, which comes from a poem about this character, Robin of Locksley, who's an English yeoman. And the way it kind of made its way into modern literature and modern fantasy writing is very much through Lord of the Rings, through Tolkien. And he's got the archery is a central concept of Lord of the Rings. But the archery practiced in Lord of the Rings, in many cases, is very much this ranger type archery where you've got this highly skilled marksman who's very much a Robin Hood kind of character, very skilled with the bow, who lurks through the forest and ambushes people, and that's where the Rangers of Athelion and all that come from. And while there were certainly archers who were that capable with a bow, who could draw a full length yew longbow and hit somebody dead in the forehead at 100 yards, that existed, but it certainly was not common. And much more often you'd get, for example, just to keep on since we're talking about fantasy, to keep on the Lord of the Rings path, what you see for example, in the Peter Jackson adaptation, if you see the Battle of Helm's Deep, the archers just firing off mass volleys from the walls and tons of arrows bouncing off of plate armor, and it basically being nothing but a slight impediment to the enemy advance. That is what medieval archery was for the most part. And the average bow used by the Nordic peoples, by the Vikings, by the Normans, by the French, the Germans, the bows they were using up until they adopted the crossbow. And in some cases, like the Vikings did not ever adopt a crossbow. It just wasn't a practical weapon because the Viking method of warfare was based around these very fast, amphibious invasions, and taking the enemy by surprise. Vikings didn't like to lay siege, and they fought in shield wall formations for the most part. And that's why the Viking Age kind of dies out after 1066, is because the mounted knight took precedence, and that's just not how the Vikings fought. You couldn't take a horse on a longboat; it just wasn't going to work for you. But so most of the bows used throughout European history were 30 to 60 pound draw weight. Would definitely be enough they were mostly just basically hunting bows, and they would be enough to take down a completely unarmored deer, but by no means were you going to be penetrating chainmail and plate mail with that. You could even possibly not penetrate at enough distance. If you were at even the slightest angle, it would bounce off of leather and just leave a little scratch mark. Even swords could be stopped by a gambesson, which was just 5-6 layers of linen stacked on top of each other, or wool. So when you see medieval battles portrayed in fantasy literature and fantasy movies, there's often just these people shooting arrows, and it goes straight through plate mail and kills somebody, and that's just not what would happen. If you had a very skilled Welsh longbowman who had been practicing with this thing, and often they came from the marches, so that border between Wales and England, because that was where most of the warfare was happening, and that was where you essentially were having people recruited from by the English and the Welsh. So one of them who was practicing using, a 150-pound draw weight yew longbow at less than 100 yards, less than 100 meters, that person probably could shoot an armored knight and kill them by penetrating their armor in a weak point. But it wasn't going to be, it just wasn't efficient in medieval warfare to use that kind of tactic.
Yeah.
And of course, ambush tactics, hit and run tactics existed. And, that's where a lot of this comes from, is that Robin Hood type story, that legend of, the yeoman out in the woods with his band of thieves who are all very skilled marksmen and all that. But if you were actually looking at a pitched medieval battle, for example, Agincourt, what the English were doing is they recruited this massive army of peasant longbowmen and pikemen, the pikemen primarily being from the north and the longbowmen primarily being from the west, from Wales and the marches. And at that point, the English had seen the utility of the longbow, and they were starting to train their own longbowmen from a younger age. But it was still predominantly the Welsh marches that were supplying these men to the English army. And at Agincourt, what happened was the mud made it so that the French knights couldn't really move that efficiently, and they lined up their pikemen to create a barrier, sat their archers back, and just would unleash volley after volley of hundreds, if not thousands, of arrows from these very, very strong yew longbows that were about 6 feet long. That's taller than me. That's a you got to remember the average height of a medieval person was 5'6", 5'7", and they were using these 6 foot long bows that were, again, I don't think people quite realize this. 150 pounds draw weight means you're launching that thing a quarter of a mile.
Yeah,
that arrow is going a quarter of a mile. That is like, guns do that.
Yeah. So
that's the maximum efficient. That's the maximum effective range of like an AK-47.
That's insane. So
yeah,
I always remember the Battle of Cressy because
yes,
similar in terms of.
It's just so funny. It's such a funny story.
Yeah, because that was similar because it was more of a tactical advantage, and they couldn't get up the hill.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the French couldn't get up the hill at the English, and they just basically unloaded on them. Is that is that what happened?
Yeah, I mean it's very similar to what happened at Hastings as well. You had the English sitting up on a hill with their pikemen out front, and they would have their archers also drive stakes into the ground in front of them. So they didn't even really always need their pikemen. They already had their stakes, which would get you probably an extra volley during a mounted charge, the extra seconds it would buy you. But they basically just sat their archers on a hill, and as the French charged, they just would launch volley after volley of these very, very powerful bows, shooting rather an arrow for a longbow. You're looking at about, this long, a couple of feet with a very heavy, steel broadhead for combat. These were, it was brutal. And for a long time, the English actually employed mixed armies of longbowmen and musketeers until it became much cheaper to use muskets. But yeah, a longbow might not penetrate, full plate armor with, chainmail in the joints and leather underneath. Like a fully armored mounted knight, if they got hit right in the breastplate, probably going to be okay. Might knock the wind out of them, but longbow arrow probably not going to penetrate it. Crossbow, on the other hand, will. But a longbow isn't going to do that. But you got to remember, the vast majority of soldiers fighting these wars were not wearing high-quality plate armor. They were wearing leather, they were wearing gambesons, they were wearing chainmail, and a longbow would absolutely, if it got you at the right angle, penetrate chainmail. And within 100 yards, this is like getting shot with a gun. And the other thing that would happen is, and the reason the English were so effective, and the reason that the longbow became this mythical weapon that's so commonly used in fantasy literature, is because it was accurate, it was powerful, and it was just like more reliable. You could hit somebody at a range that there was no possible way they could hit you. So the English had this advantage with their armies, where even going up against other well-equipped, well-trained, well-funded armies, they were going to be able to get off, even at an army of like a French army, like that would be primarily on horseback, they'd be able to get off 4 or 5 volleys before the French would even hit their lines. And you got to remember also, the knights themselves were armored, but the horses weren't.
Yeah.
They might be lightly armored with like cloth and leather, but you weren't going to have a horse riding around in plate mail. That's something that's been completely fabricated, that that would happen. That was like for jousting. This thing is, a lot of the sets of armor that we have that survive from the Middle Ages are tournament sets. So for a long time, people were like, "Oh, that's what combat armor looked like," but that's probably not true.
Yeah.
But yeah, so the English had this advantage where they could start hitting your army while you were a quarter mile away from them, and then what are you going to do about that? But that was the primary method of archery warfare. Was the second you thought you could hit them, you were just launching volleys at their infantry as they approached. And the Vikings would do this. They would do this from their ships. They would do this from behind their infantry lines. They would just get lots and lots of these very relatively weak bows, but it's a lot harder to advance if you have a shower of arrows coming down on top of you. And the Vikings actually used the longbow used the bow as suppressive artillery very effectively. We have lots of accounts of the Vikings, landing a force and then, putting some archers behind their line and just launching arrows to keep the enemy's head down. Whereas the French and the Germans took a bit more of they used the crossbow very extensively. And that was a weapon that obviously took a lot more time to reload. So you're going to aim your shots a little bit more. But against an army that their bows outranged yours, that just wasn't an option. And there's the example of Cressy, for example, where you had the French send up their Genovese crossbow mercenaries. These were arguably some of the best crossbowmen in the world. Yeah. And they couldn't get to firing range because they were just getting torn up. They were just getting turned into Swiss cheese by all of these longbow arrows that were just raining down on them. And even when they would turn around to they had those big Pavis shields on their back. Yeah. Even when they would turn around to reload and have that shield that was supposed to protect them from arrow fire, the longbows would penetrate those shields. So it was just this crazy powerful weapon that only really faded out of popularity because it was much cheaper and it took a lot less time. And that was really what it was the time that it took to train a longbowman. It took 15, 20 years to get somebody to the point where they were going to be effective in battle as a longbowman. You could train somebody to use a musket and fire in a volley in 2 weeks. So that's why musket warfare took over for as long as it did. And that's why, as time has gone on, we've seen the evolution of, we use snipers a lot in modern combat, but obviously not everyone we employ in the field today can be a sniper because it takes years to train to that level of skill with a rifle. And with a longbow, it was the same thing. It took a lifetime of learning, and that's why that's one of the reasons why in Tolkien's work, in even like John Flanagan, The Ranger's Apprentice, even in that work, you're looking at very small numbers of people who have this very high skill level with a bow. Yeah, and it's very cool what they've done with fantasy literature and with fantasy film and media, where you have these examples of all of these, super talented archers having, their ambuscades set up and all that. But that was not the majority way that this was fought. That was the very rare exception to the rule of using it as the same as basically suppressive machine gun fire is used today.
Yeah, it's fascinating. One thing I wanted to ask you about as well, I did a bit of archery a couple of years ago now with a guy who used to shoot for Great Britain in the young sort of Olympic team, and he taught me so much about it. So like the armor that you wear and things like that. One thing that stuck in my mind is the quiver and the positioning of the quiver, because everybody has in fantasy the quiver on the shoulder, or if it's on the sort of hip, you've got them pointing the wrong way. So
Yep.
you've got them putting back behind you. So when you come to get an arrow, you've got no arrows left in your quiver because
You gotta like, yeah, it's totally messed up.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's likely that, you know, quivers obviously were a real thing. They were used, but they were probably used more in hunting. So, and because it's going to be very hard to run with a quiver because your arrows are going to be
Yeah.
whether it's on your back or on your hip. When you would get into combat, you would literally you would have either basically a box that you would set on the ground that you would throw all your arrows in, or more commonly, you would just take your 24 arrows you brought with you and just shove them point first into the ground, so that you could just grab them really quick and knock them straight to your bow. It's really cool when you see Robin Hood, lean back and whoever's playing him at the time and just like knock an arrow and 500 yards into the eye of some armored knight through his like slit in his visor. But that just wasn't what happened. Quivers definitely existed, definitely used, but probably not in combat, especially in the set piece fighting of the high and late Middle Ages. Now, if you're looking at like the Viking Age, that's where you would see a quiver used more in the way it's portrayed in fantasy literature and media, is this mobile kind of thing. But it certainly wouldn't be facing back away from you, because then you're just going to lose your arrows. They were also used for horseback very commonly if you were shooting from horseback. But even then, a lot of the times you would have your quivers mounted up on the shoulders of the horse or on its flanks next to you, just straight up to prevent any of the arrows from falling out. But yeah, it's the whole idea of the way quivers are portrayed and used in film and media. It looks really cool, and it creates a very like cool picture in our heads when we read it, but it's not even remotely accurate to how the battles were fought.
Yeah, it's all about speed, isn't it, in the battle?
Yeah,
so
exactly. You don't want to be wrestling with your quiver and then it's slinking down your back and you can't quite reach. You gotta be like, oi Jimmy, can you fix my... No, you want to be able to just reach down, grab the arrow, knock it, pull, aim, fire. And there are, for example, in the Battle for Scandia, which is I think the 4th book of the Ranger's Apprentice series, which is one of my favorite fantasy series of all time. It's written for younger people, and I read it when I was a kid, but they still hold up, honestly, going back and reading them. They just have much simpler themes. So, but there's a very vivid scene in that where Will, who's a ranger's apprentice, he's this younger version. Essentially, if you think of the Dunedain Rangers from Lord of the Rings, that's basically what John Flanagan was doing, but with this kind of different, more politicized system where they're kind of like a sheriff almost. But there's this scene where Will has trained a whole bunch of Scandian fighters, who are obviously a society based off the Vikings. Yeah. And then he's trained them against what appears to be a society based off of the Mongols. And he's got them, one guy will hold up a shield while the other reloads his bow. And it's just very simple. They've got the arrows out in front of them in a box. They grab the arrow, they knock it, they aim at a certain angle, fire, shield goes back up, they repeat. And that's, obviously without the shields, but that's what it would look like in a medieval battle. So at Cressy, at Agincourt, that's probably what happened, was they had these lines of longbowmen sitting there, would go off with a volley within 10 seconds, 15 seconds. They're ready to go. They shoot again. And when you think about how long it takes to cross, 400 yards on foot, or at Cressy, that would have been on horseback, but up a hill. So 400 yards on horseback, up a hill, it's gonna take you 20, 30 seconds.
Yeah.
And then you got to convince the horse to charge through pikes and stakes. So you're getting 3-4 volleys off probably. And then at Poitiers, where the French king decided that the horses were traitors and had his knights charge a mile in 96-degree heat in full armor, try to run 400 yards in full medieval plate armor, and you've got people shooting at you. Like, it's just not going to work out for you. those three battles, Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt, they are the fascinating example of why the longbow was the powerhouse that it was in the medieval period. But you also have to look at the way it was being used, because that's one thing that was very important. And for example, to use an example of the English getting beaten by the longbow, I'm trying to remember the specific location of the battle. It was during the Glendower Rising, and it was Owain Glendower versus Edmund Mortimer. And Mortimer's army was larger than Glendower's and had more cavalry and everything. And what Owain did was he set his guys up on a hill. And it's going to come to me the second we get off of this. I'm going to remember the name of the battle. I think it was in 1402. They're up at the top of the hill, and he's got his infantry out in front. He's got his longbowmen further up the hill. And Mortimer's force is made up of similar forces, but larger in number. So he's got his infantry moving up the hill into longbow fire. And obviously that's slowing them down. He's got his own longbowmen down at the bottom of the hill, shooting up at the Welsh, but mostly missing. They couldn't quite, the Welsh had more range because of being on the hill. Yeah. So the longbowmen on Mortimer's side couldn't get close enough without being in the line of fire themselves. So as Mortimer's footmen inched their way up the hill, Owain had taken the opportunity before the battle to send some of his own men into the English ranks as longbowmen to convince the Welsh soldiers fighting for the English army to turn against the English during the battle. And then Mortimer's footmen, while they were on the hill, ended up getting shot at from both sides. And then Owen's cavalry came in from the sides where they had been hiding off in a gully to finish the job. So basically, the only people to use the longbow more efficiently than the English were the people they were taking the weapon from, which makes sense. But it also, a lot of people have posed the question, why did the English have so much success when they colonized the Americas? Given the guerrilla tactics used by the Native Americans, how did they manage to beat that when so many other European nations failed? Why, the French had to ally with the Native Americans. The British conquered. And to a large extent, you could probably wager that it's that they had this long breadth of experience of, stories of fighting the Welsh in these forests and on these mountainsides, where the Welsh were just popping out from behind rocks and shooting at them with longbows. So the English were used to it, and they used it greatly to their advantage in their colonization efforts.
Yeah, it's amazing. Aidan, that's been fascinating talking again, and you've dispelled a lot of the myths, I think, that haunts fantasy.
It's got a lot of myths, and I've always found it weird because the truth is just as cool.
Yeah. So I hope you've learned something new there, chaps, because I have, again, learned something new as well. Aidan, it's been a pleasure having you back on.
Thank you.
Where can we find you?
You can find me on YouTube and Instagram at The Lore Lodge, and on pretty much everything else at the Aidan Mattis.
Fantastic. And we'll be back next week with a look at medieval life, which again is something that is often misrepresented in fantasy. Until next time.